Imagine for a moment absolute darkness, a world veiled in a shroud of dust and ash. The sun is just a faint shimmer in the sky. It is cold, and it is silent, eerily silent. No sound breaks the darkness, no bird call, no rustling in the undergrowth. Only emptiness, only silence. 66 million years ago, a colossal asteroid struck the Earth. With unimaginable force, it hit our planet and ended an era. It was the end of the more than 150 million year reign of the dinosaurs. Their time had run out. But the end of one story is often the beginning of a new one. And in the shadows of this global catastrophe, deep in the undergrowth of the dying forests, something stirred. Small, inconspicuous creatures, often no larger than a modern-day shrew, had survived. They lived in hiding, feeding on whatever they could find, trembling, but alive. They were our earliest mammalian ancestors, warm-blooded, nocturnal, adaptable. They were the secret heirs to an almost lost world. The fall of the dinosaurs was their greatest, and perhaps only, chance. Suddenly, countless ecological niches were unoccupied. The world was an empty stage, waiting to be repopulated. And what happened next was a true explosion of life. Biologists call it an adaptive radiation. It was as if evolution had taken its finger off the pause button. The mammals, long in the shadow of the giant reptiles, now took the main stage. They evolved into thousands of new, astonishing forms. They conquered the land. They conquered the air in the form of bats, and they even conquered the oceans as the ancestors of today's whales. The diversity was breathtaking. One of these new lineages took a very special path. They were the primates. Long before the time we will now delve into, early, almost mouse-like proto-primates had evolved. Small insect hunters with large eyes who found their way in the darkness. But it is only now, in the era we call the Miocene, that the lineages which directly concern us appear on the world stage. The first great apes, skillful, intelligent, and adaptable. They lived in complex social groups, moved securely through the treetops, and developed a whole new way of perceiving the world. The evolution of a large brain had begun, and with it a path that would lead to us, because their story is also ours. So, our direct ancestors chose a habitat that promised both refuge and riches. The forests that, after the great catastrophe, slowly began to cover the continents with a green carpet once more. Their new home was the dense canopy, a cathedral of light and shadow, a vertical, three-dimensional world of countless branches, swinging vines, and sun-drenched clearings, high above the forest floor, far from many dangers. And this life in the treetops, it was like a long, patient education. It shaped our ancestors in a way that would forever define their future, and thus ours. It was a silent school, teaching lessons that resonate within us to this day. The first lesson was for the hands. Where other animals had sharp claws to dig into the bark, our ancestors developed something far more subtle, far more versatile. They were grasping hands, with soft, sensitive fingertips and a thumb that could be opposed to the other fingers. A hand that could not only hold, but also embrace. A hand that could grip a branch with the same certainty as it could pick a ripe fruit without crushing it, or catch a small insect hiding on a leaf. Every movement a test of fine motor skills, an unconscious training for a future in which these hands would one day hold tools. The second lesson was for the eyes, slowly, over countless generations. The eyes migrated from the sides of the head to the front. They now looked together in the same direction. This gave them a new, almost magical ability, spatial, stereoscopic vision. Suddenly, the world had depth. They could now judge distances with precision, the exact gap to the next branch, the dangerous drop below them. A misstep could mean death. Good vision was the key to survival in this floating world. But perhaps the most important and profound development took place in secret, inside the skull. Because life was more than just climbing and eating, it was a social game. Our ancestors lived in groups, and this communal living placed entirely new demands on the brain. It had to remember the complex relationships within the community. Who was dominant? Who was submissive? Who was a reliable partner? Who a rival? Who was a friend? And who was a foe? Those who could observe, communicate, and cooperate well, but perhaps also deceive, had a decisive advantage. The roots of our complex social nature, our capacity for empathy, but also for cunning, lie here, in the social dramas that played out daily in the treetops. Scientists, to this day, debate what the exact trigger for all these changes was. Was it life in the trees alone, or was it the hunting of insects in the dense undergrowth? Most likely, both are true. It was the interplay of all these challenges. Life in a complex, three-dimensional, and deeply social world shaped our ancestors and equipped them with a unique toolkit. A toolkit of skillful hands, sharp eyes, and an alert social mind. A legacy that we carry within us to this day. The world of our ancestors was changing relentlessly. The protective forests, their home for millions of years, increasingly gave way to the open, wide savanna. The islands of trees grew smaller, and the distances between them grew larger. The ground, once a zone to be avoided, now became a path that one had to cross. And on this dangerous ground, perhaps the greatest and most consequential revolution of our entire history began. A silent revolution, fought not with weapons or words, but with bone and muscle. It was the slow, hesitant transition to walking upright. This was not a sudden event, not a single hero who one morning simply stood up straight. It was a process that stretched over hundreds of thousands of years, a careful reconstruction of the entire body. The spine, once a simple arch, gently curved into a double S shape to cushion the weight of the upper body like an elegant shock absorber. The pelvis became shorter and broader. It formed into a supportive bowl, holding the internal organs securely and serving as an anchor for powerful new gluteal muscles that stabilized us with every step. The legs grew longer, stronger. The knees moved directly under the body's center of gravity to carry the entire weight effortlessly. And the feet. They gave up their old ability to grasp and became a masterpiece of locomotion. They developed an arch that acted like a spring with every step, and the big toe aligned with the others to give us a powerful push forward. It was an evolutionary gamble, a compromise. because this new body plan also brought disadvantages. A vulnerability to back or knee problems that many of us still feel today. But it was a gamble that paid off, because the advantages were immense. Standing upright, one could see over the tall grass of the savanna, spot predators early, or discover distant carcasses. On two legs, one could cover long distances much more energy efficiently, an invaluable advantage in a world where food was widely scattered. An upright body offered a much smaller surface area to the hot midday sun and was better cooled by the wind. But the greatest gift of this change was the freedom of the hands. The hands, no longer needed for walking, were now permanently free. Free to carry food, free to hold children securely to the body, and free to shape a distant, unimaginable future. It was this gift that would later make possible the creation of the first tools, the unfolding of art, and all the wonders of human creativity. The first step had been taken, and nothing would ever be the same again. Scientists had long suspected the theory of upright walking, but a theory alone is just a shadow of the truth. A proof was needed, a messenger from this distant past, and in the year 1974, they found one. In the dry expanses of Ethiopia, a team of researchers came across the fossilized bones of a single individual. It was not a complete skeleton, but it was almost 40% preserved, an incredible stroke of luck. They named her Lucy, after a song that was playing in their camp that evening. Lucy was a sensation because she was a perfect mosaic, a creature of two worlds. Her pelvis and leg bones proved beyond any doubt that she walked on two legs. Her anatomy was clearly that of an upright walking creature, but her long arms and slightly curved fingers betrayed a different heritage. They told the story of a life that was also still lived in the trees. She was an excellent climber. Lucy lived in both worlds, on the safe branch at night, and on the open ground by day. She was the living compromise, the physical evidence of this momentous transition in our history. And as if this discovery were not enough, science made an even more poetic discovery a few years later. In Latoli in Tanzania, they found no bones, but footprints. 3.6 million years ago, a volcano had erupted there, covering the landscape with a fine layer of moist ash. Across this soft blanket, some of our ancestors walked. The sun dried their prints, and the next rain sealed them under a new layer, a moment frozen for eternity. These footprints are more than just scientific evidence. They are a fossilized snapshot, a moment of almost intimate familiarity. If you close your eyes, you can almost see them. Two adults walking side by side through the damp ash, and right behind them, a small child trying to place its tiny feet exactly into the large footprints of the adult in front, step by step. You can feel the sun on their skin. You can sense the vastness of the savanna around them. You see a family on their daily journey. Lucy and the traces of Latoli are the immortal witnesses. They not only tell us that our ancestors walked upright, they also show us how they did it, together as social beings, on the long path to a new future. Lucy and the Laetoli footprints are so famous that it's easy to believe her species was the only one walking the earth at that time, but that is a misconception. The truth is far more complex and more fascinating. Evolution is not a race with a single finish line. You don't have to imagine the family tree of our ancestors as a straight ladder leading step by step to the top. Instead, picture it as a dense old bush, full of paths that fork, that cross, and many of which simply end in nothing. At the time of Lucy, nature was experimenting with different models of upright walking. The Earth was populated by a diverse family of bipedal apes, occupying various ecological niches. We were, even back then, never alone. In South Africa, for example, the remains of another species were found, called Australopithecus africanus. One of its most famous representatives is the Taung child, the fossilized skull of a young child. The species was a bit more slender, built slightly differently than Lucy, another branch on our great family bush. And in Kenya, an even stranger contemporary was discovered, Kenyanthropus platyops. Its name means the flat-faced man from Kenya. Its face was unusually flat and modern for its time, a completely different blueprint that existed at the same time as Lucy's species. It is important to understand that not every one of these discoveries is a direct ancestor of ours. Many of them are more like extinct cousins. They lived at the same time as our direct ancestors, belonged to the same large family, but they took a different evolutionary path. This diversity shows us something important. There was no single predetermined path to becoming human. There were many attempts, many experiments, and for a long time it was completely unclear which of these paths would lead to the future, and which would end in a dead end. So, while one line of our ancestors took the path of the flexible generalist, another, very successful group chose the path of extreme specialization. It is important to understand. This was a side branch of our family, not a direct ancestor of ours, a different answer to the challenges of the Savanna. We call this genus Paranthropus, and they were truly impressive. Imagine a being that walked upright like our ancestors, but whose skull was built for a single immense task, chewing. Their molars were huge, flat and wide like small millstones. Their jaw was massive and powerful, and to move this enormous jaw, they possessed chewing muscles so immense that they had to attach to a bony crest on the top of their skull, similar to that of a modern gorilla. They were the Nutcracker men. Their specialization was their superpower. They were designed to grind extremely tough, fibrous plant foods, chewy roots, hard nuts, dry seeds, food that was inedible for most other animals and also for our more direct ancestors. And for over 1 million years, this strategy was a huge success. They occupied a niche where they had little competition. They spread across Africa and thrived. They were, for a very long time, an evolutionary masterpiece. But every extreme specialization carries a risk. When the climate changed again, when the landscape became drier, and the very plants to which they were so perfectly adapted became scarcer, their greatest strength became their fatal weakness. They were too inflexible to change their diet. Their entire body was geared towards a single food source, and so they vanished after more than 1,000,000 years of success, quietly exiting the stage of evolution. Their story teaches us a crucial lesson. Sometimes it is not pure strength or perfect adaptation to the moment that ensures survival, but the ability to remain flexible, the ability to change when the world around you changes. A path that our direct ancestors were about to take. So, our ancestors now stood upright in the vastness of the African savanna. A crucial step had been taken, yet their lives were still a constant struggle. They were adaptable generalists, hunters of smaller animals and gatherers of fruits and roots. But they were far from the top of the food chain. They were hunters, and very often also the hunted. But the savanna, this dangerous open landscape, offered a new, almost irresistible temptation. The remains of large animal carcasses left behind by the great predatory cats of that time. A huge herd of wildebeest from which a pride of lions had taken only a single animal, an elephant that had died of old age. These carcasses were a treasure trove, a vault full of proteins and fats, the building blocks for growth, for strength. But there was a formidable problem. How could one access these precious nutrients without the fangs of a saber-toothed tiger, without the claws of a hyena? How could one penetrate the thick, leathery hide of a wildebeest, or break open the massive, long bones of a buffalo? The answer to this question marks the beginning of a completely new chapter in our history. It is the moment when a thought becomes an action, the moment when technology is born. Imagine one of these early creatures, a Homo habilis. He is crouching on the bank of a dried-up riverbed, surrounded by countless pebbles, smoothed by water and time. He is not alone. His small group keeps watch nearby. He takes a fist-sized stone in his hand, tests its weight, its shape, the feel of the cool rock on his skin. Then, his gaze scans the surroundings until he finds a second, heavier stone that fits well in his other hand. What happens next is no longer just random trial and error. It is an act of foresight, of deliberate planning. He knows what he wants to do. He has a clear image of the final product in his mind. He has seen it done countless times by other, more experienced members of his group. With a focused, practiced movement, he strikes the pebble in his other hand with the hammerstone at exactly the right angle, with precisely the right amount of force. A sharp, clicking sound, a razor-sharp flake splits off. He has succeeded. He now holds two things in his hands that will ensure his survival. The remaining core stone, the so-called chopper, heavy and robust, perfect for smashing. And the inconspicuous flake, a small piece of stone with an edge as sharp as a scalpel. He holds the first technology of humankind in his hands. We call this earliest yet infinitely important tool culture the Oldowan culture. Today, through experimental archaeology, researchers can replicate this process, and they know how much knowledge, practice, and skill it required. It is a skill that had to be learned, practiced, and passed down through generations. The first form of culture. And with this new self-made superpower, everything changed. With the sharp edges of the flakes, they could now do what their teeth never could. They could cut through the thick hides of animals, which were an insurmountable barrier for most other scavengers. They could sever tough tendons and cut out large pieces of meat to carry to a safer place. And with the heavy core stone, they could do what almost no other animal could. They could smash open the long bones of the carcasses and get to the extremely nutritious, fat-rich marrow inside. A true calorie bomb. The high-energy fuel for a revolution that was about to take place in secret, within the brain. The first thought from stone had pushed open the door to a whole new world for our ancestors. A world in which they were no longer just victims of circumstance, but were beginning to take their destiny into their own hands. This revolutionary new technology of stone tools is so closely linked to a new species of our ancestors that it was even named for it. Scientists gave it the name Homo habilis, which means the handyman or the craftsman. With it, an entirely new genus enters the stage of evolution, the genus Homo, the genus of humans. Homo habilis was first discovered in the famous Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, the same place where countless of these simple stone tools were also found. But who exactly was this new relative? On the outside, he was not yet a great hero. He was relatively small, perhaps a little over a meter tall, and his arms were still quite long in proportion to his legs. A distant echo of life in the trees. But his face was already a bit different from Lucy's. It was flatter, less ape-like. And the most important thing was hidden inside his skull. His brain was the crucial difference. Averaging 650 cubic centimeters, it was significantly larger than the brain of the Australopithecines. It was perhaps only about half of our modern brain volume, but it was a tremendous evolutionary leap. For the first time, a critical threshold had been crossed, and CT scans of his skull imprints show us that the brain regions we now associate with planning, problem-solving, and the fine control of the hands were particularly well developed. The hardware for tool use was in place. He likely lived in small, mobile groups of perhaps 15 to 20 individuals. They moved through the varied mosaic landscapes of the Savanna, always close to vital water sources. Their life was a constant search for food, for safety, for opportunities. But was Homo habilis really the very first to shape a stone? For a long time, that was the belief. But the story, as is often the case, is more complicated. In Lomekwi, in Kenya, tools have been found that are much older, over 3 million years old. Crude, heavy tools that may have been made by late Australopithecines. The debate about this is still in full swing. But even if Homo habilis was not the very first inventor, he was almost certainly the first species for whom this new technology was a central, systematic, and defining part of its survival strategy. He was no longer just an ape who occasionally used a branch. He was a being whose life and whose brain were inextricably linked with the art of creating a living tool from a dead stone. He was the first technologist. We now face one of the most fascinating questions of our entire evolution, a classic chicken and egg problem. Which came first? Was it the larger brain that made the creation of tools possible in the first place? Or was it the tools that, through better nutrition, fueled the growth of the brain? The answer is as elegant as it is profound. It was neither. It was both simultaneously. It was a positive feedback loop, a self-reinforcing spiral that launched our ancestors onto a completely new evolutionary path. A path that would set them apart from all other animals on this planet. Imagine this spiral of progress, slowly set in motion over thousands of generations. It all begins, perhaps, with a small, random genetic change. An individual is born with a brain just a little bit larger than that of its peers. This is the first step of the spiral. This slightly larger brain might enable it to create a slightly better tool, an edge that is a little sharper, a strike that is a little more precise. With that, the second step begins. This better tool gives it better access to the high-quality food we've already encountered. It can open the hide of a carcass faster. It can smash the bones more efficiently to get to the fat-rich marrow. And here comes the third crucial step. This new, high-quality food provides a surplus of calories and nutrients. And this surplus energy is virtually absorbed by one organ in the body, the brain. Our brain is an extreme luxury organ. It makes up only about 2% of our body weight, but at rest it consumes over 20% of our total energy. Without a high-energy food source, a large brain is simply unaffordable. With this new fuel, the brain can now continue to grow. This is the fourth step of the spiral. A child that is better nourished can realize its full genetic potential for a larger brain. And this larger brain, in turn, allows for the creation of even more complex tools, the development of better strategies, and a deeper understanding of the world. The spiral continues to turn. Better tools, better food, a larger brain, better tools. This cycle also fundamentally changed daily life. The search for carcasses and their dismemberment was a risky endeavor. One had to be quick before the more powerful predators returned. This required more cooperation, more communication. Perhaps through simple sounds, through gestures, and it raised new social questions. Who shares the valuable prize? Who gets how much? The one who discovered the carcass, the one who made the tool, or the one who defended the group? The beginnings of social complexity, of simple rules, of an early form of justice, were laid here, around the shared meal. The spiral didn't just affect the brain and food. It began to shape society itself. The image we often have in our minds is that of man, the hunter, a heroic ancestor who brings down a large animal with his stone tool. But this image, as catchy as it may be, is incomplete and likely even wrong for this early period. To truly understand the life of Homo habilis, we must broaden our view and consider the silent yet crucial infrastructure of survival that was supported by the entire group. The consumption of meat, so vital for brain growth, likely came, as we saw, mainly from scavenging. A dangerous niche. Approaching a freshly killed carcass while the lions were perhaps still nearby was not a task for a single individual. It was a job for a coordinated group. Some might have distracted the predators while others quickly cut out the best pieces. Cooperation was the key to the meat. But the meat was only part of the story. Often, it was a rare stroke of luck, the true foundation of daily life, the silent infrastructure that ensured survival day after day. lay in other hands. While a small group might have been searching for a carcass, the rest of the community provided the reliable foundations. It was often the women and the older, more experienced members who played this decisive role. They knew the landscape like the back of their hand. They knew which fruits were ripe, which tubers could be dug up, and where the hidden water sources were located. Their gathering activities often supplied the majority of the daily calories. They were the social and nutritional backbone of the group. And there was another infinitely important task: raising the children. A child with a larger brain takes longer to mature. It is helpless for longer, more dependent on the protection and care of the community. This long childhood required intensive care and created deep, strong social bonds. In this community, knowledge had to be passed on. A child did not learn how to perfectly shape a stone by instinct. It learned by watching, by imitating, through years of practice. The rules of living together, the art of tool making, the knowledge of edible plants, all of this was passed down from one generation to the next. This dense social network, this constant need for cooperation and exchange, was perhaps the most important achievement of all. It was the fertile ground on which more complex forms of culture, of rituals, and perhaps even the very first simple forms of language could later grow. Survival was not a solitary struggle. It was always a community effort. After the long, quiet dawn of Homo habilis, a new human now enters the stage of evolution, an ancestor so different, so powerful, and so successful that he would change the story of our genus forever. His name is Homo erectus, the upright man, a name that almost understates what he truly was. To this day, scientists engage in a quiet debate over the precise designation. The earliest African forms of this new human are often considered a separate species, Homo ergaster, the working man. The later fossils found in Asia retain the name Homo erectus, but the lines are blurry, the differences subtle. And for our story, for understanding this immense revolution, we will use the more familiar name for this entire groundbreaking human type. And he was a revolution of flesh and blood. Imagine if you could observe him for a moment in the African savanna. He is taller than his predecessors, well over 1.5 meters tall, slender, and athletic. His physique is already uncannily familiar to us. He has long legs and relatively short arms, the proportions of a modern long-distance runner. With him, humankind definitively becomes a wanderer. The last sentimental connection to the trees, which we still saw with Lucy and Homo habilis, has been severed. His home is the open, wide earth. His entire body is no longer a compromise. It is a masterpiece of locomotion on the ground, perfected for running over long distances. He is a born endurance runner. Consider his feet. They have a pronounced arch that stores energy with every step and releases it like a spring. Consider his Achilles tendon, the strong tendon at our heel. In him, it was long and elastic, another rubber band that made every stride more efficient. His gluteal muscles, especially the gluteus maximus, were powerful and stabilized his torso while running, preventing him from pitching forward. And his skin, it was largely hairless and covered with millions of sweat glands. an ingenious built-in cooling system that allowed him to remain active even in the merciless midday heat while most other animals were forced to rest in the shade. All of these adaptations together enabled a completely new, almost eerie hunting strategy: persistence hunting. Imagine a small group of Homo erectus as they follow an antelope in the shimmering heat of the savanna. They are not faster than their prey, not in a sprint. Their strength does not lie in explosive power, but they have more endurance. They run and run at a steady, relentless, almost meditative pace. Hour after hour, the animal sprints, gains distance, stops to catch its breath. The hunters catch up. The animal sprints again, but it cannot escape its own body heat. While our ancestors are cooled by sweating and can regulate their body temperature, the animal's rises unstoppably. Eventually, after many kilometers, it collapses, exhausted and overheated. Without a single spear thrown, the prey was brought down solely through the power of endurance. And inside the skull of this endurance runner grew an even larger, more capable brain. With a volume that often exceeded 1,000 cubic centimeters, it was already moving significantly closer to our own brain volume. A brain capable of sustaining complex hunting strategies for hours on end, of reading the tracks and behavior of animals, and of understanding the world in a new, deeper way. This new human was ready. Ready not just to survive in his African homeland, but to cross the boundaries of his world and to conquer it. With his new body and his larger mind, Homo erectus was no longer bound to the landscapes of his birth. He had become a wanderer, and the world lay at his feet. And so, nearly 2 million years ago, something happened that would change the history of life on this planet forever. For the first time, a member of our direct lineage left its homeland, the African continent. This is more than just a migration. It is a monumental moment. For the first time in the history of life, a creature no longer changes its world merely locally by adapting to circumstances. It begins to conquer it globally by simply taking its own niche with it. A small step for a small group, but a giant leap for all of humankind. But we must not imagine this as a planned exodus. There were no maps, no leaders who intended to guide their group to a new continent. It was a slow, almost imperceptible expansion that stretched over thousands of generations. One group might have followed a herd of animals a few kilometers further north than the generation before. The next generation followed them. It was a process driven by several factors. They followed their prey. The great herds of gazelles, horses, and deer that roamed across the grasslands. They were driven by the great climate fluctuations of the ice ages. During warmer periods, green corridors opened up, for example, through what is now the Sahara or across the Sinai Peninsula, pointing the way to new worlds. And of course, there were their new abilities. Their adaptability, their robust bodies, and their alert minds made it possible for them to survive in new environments, find new food sources, and overcome new challenges. A deep, innate curiosity may have driven them ever onward, beyond the next hill, across the next river. And so we suddenly find their traces in places thousands of kilometers away from Africa, in the Middle East, in the caves of China, and on the islands of Indonesia. However, perhaps the most fascinating and, at the same time, most puzzling traces of this first world journey were discovered in Dmanisi, in modern-day Georgia, at the edge of Europe. There, the remains of several individuals were found, dated to an incredible age of 1.8 million years. They are among the oldest evidence of humans outside of Africa. The paradox of Dmanisi lies in who these pioneers were. Their skeletons show that they were still surprisingly small, hardly taller than a Homo habilis. And the tools found with them were not the new, advanced hand axes. They were the simple choppers and flakes of the old Oldowan culture. This means they left Africa before all the great innovations we associate with Homo erectus. His large body, his huge brain, the advanced hand axe, were fully developed. These early pioneers were not highly equipped conquerors. They were small, tough survivors. And their journey shows us that the urge to explore the world, the urge to see what lies beyond the horizon, may be rooted even deeper and older within us than we ever thought. As Homo erectus spread across the world, he encountered a force as old as the earth itself, a force that can give life and take it away, the power of fire. In the beginning, it was certainly not the ability to make fire. That is a complex process that came much later. In the beginning, there was the ability to use fire, to tend to it, and to overcome the fear of it. Imagine the scene. A dark night on the African savanna, illuminated only by the pale light of the stars. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning tears across the sky and strikes an old, dry tree. It instantly catches fire, a blazing torch in the darkness. All other animals flee in panic from the heat, the smoke, and the eerie crackling. It is an instinct deeply rooted within them. But a small group of our ancestors, they do not run away. They stop. They watch, driven by a deep, almost irresistible curiosity that is stronger than their fear. They are fascinated by the warmth emanating from the flame, by the dancing, mesmerizing light that turns night into day. Perhaps the bravest among them dares to step forward. He breaks off a burning branch and carries it carefully, like an immeasurable treasure, back to the group's campsite. They have captured the fire. They have become the keepers of the flame. And this single act changed everything. The campfire provided warmth on cold nights, enabling them to settle in cooler regions of Europe and Asia that would have otherwise remained forever closed to them. It provided light. The day no longer ended with the sunset. The darkness, the domain of predators, was pushed back. By the fire, they could continue to work, communicate, and be together even after nightfall. It offered protection. Most predators instinctively shy away from fire. A crackling campfire was like an invisible shield, keeping the group safe at night. And it became the new social center. Around the fire, the day's food was shared. They sat together, safe and secure. It was here that the social bonds so crucial for survival were forged and strengthened. But perhaps the greatest revolution, sparked by fire, took place in the stomach. It was the culinary revolution. Cooking. At some point, a piece of meat or a root tuber must have accidentally fallen into the fire. The smell was enticing, and when they tasted it, they discovered cooked food is softer, more flavorful, and above all, much easier to digest. Cooking makes the nutrients in meat and plants far more available to our bodies. It breaks down tough fibers and kills dangerous pathogens and parasites. This led to better health and provided the energy-hungry brain with an even greater boost of easily accessible energy. Many researchers believe that this was the decisive key that enabled the final major growth of our brain. The so-called cooking hypothesis suggests that it was only through cooking that we became the beings with such large and powerful brains that we are today. The fire did not just warm their bodies, it also shaped their minds. With Homo erectus and his expansion across the world, a new, far more complex tool technology also emerges. We leave behind the simple choppers and flakes of the Oldowan culture and enter a new era, the era of the Acheulean culture, named after a site in France, and its hallmark, its index fossil, is one of the most successful and long-lasting tools in human history, the hand axe. At first glance, it might just look like another worked stone, but upon closer inspection, it reveals a tremendous cognitive leap. Unlike the simple Oldowan tools, which were often about creating just a single sharp edge, the hand axe is a carefully and completely thought-out object. It is usually teardrop or almond-shaped, fits perfectly in the hand, and is worked on both sides across its entire surface. It is symmetrical. It has a clear form. It is the Swiss Army knife of the Stone Age. A beautiful, deadly, and incredibly versatile all-purpose tool. Its tip could be used for digging or drilling. Its long, sharp side edges could be used for cutting and scraping, and its heavy base could be used for smashing and hammering. But the hand axe is far more than just a tool. It is a window into the mind of its creators. It is an idea made of stone. To make a hand axe, it was no longer enough to simply strike one stone against another. The maker had to have a clear mental image of the finished product in their mind from the very beginning. They had to, in a sense, already see the finished hand axe within the raw stone and then work towards it step by step. This required an enormous capacity for planning and patience. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of precise strikes were needed to achieve the perfect form. Every strike had to be right because one wrong move could ruin the entire workpiece and waste hours of labor. And perhaps the most astonishing thing is its consistency. The basic form of the hand axe remained remarkably constant for over 1 million years and across vast geographical areas, from Africa to Europe to India. This is unmistakable evidence of a strong cultural tradition, of a concept that was not reinvented each time but was actively taught and learned. It is a standardized idea passed down from one generation to the next. This incredible stability not only shows the power of tradition, it might also suggest that this tool was so perfectly adapted to the needs of its time, so universally applicable, that for an unimaginably long period, it simply required no significant improvement. It was the first great design icon of humankind, a silent stone testament to a mind that no longer just reacted, but planned, shaped, and created. After the long era of Homo erectus, spanning nearly 1.5 million years, the stage of evolution is slowly and almost imperceptibly being set for a new act. The world is changing. The ice ages come and go, and with them, the challenges. From the African populations of the successful Homo erectus, a new, more advanced human species evolves. A species that was smarter, stronger, and better organized than all its predecessors. We call it Homo heidelbergensis, named after the site of its very first discovery. A massive lower jaw found in a sandpit near Heidelberg, Germany, back in 1907, which puzzled scientists at the time. This new human was an imposing figure. He was taller and more powerfully built than the average person today, with a robust bone structure. But the real revolution, once again, took place within. His brain had made another tremendous leap forward. With an average volume of about 1,200 cubic centimeters, it was already within the lower range of modern humans. This brain was not just larger, it was capable of complex new behaviors that we had not seen before. Homo heidelbergensis was an excellent and highly organized hunter. Perhaps the most impressive and moving evidence of his abilities are the Schöningen spears, a collection of over 300,000-year-old, perfectly balanced throwing spears, crafted from the hard wood of spruce trunks. They were found in Germany, buried in the mud of a prehistoric lake, right next to the remains of dozens of slaughtered wild horses. This is no coincidence. This is a Stone Age crime scene. Such hunts were not the lucky strikes of individuals. They prove a high level of social organization, an ability for detailed planning over days, and a complex form of communication within the hunting party. One had to understand the habits of the prey, anticipate their paths, perhaps drive them into an ambush at the lake's edge, and then, at the exact right moment, strike in a coordinated fashion. Every member of the group had their role. Homo heidelbergensis was a transitional figure. He stood with one foot still in the old, archaic world of Homo erectus, with whose hand axes he still hunted. But with the other foot, he was already stepping into a new world. A world that would be shaped by his descendants, the Neanderthals, and us, modern humans. For he is of such crucial importance to our story because he stands at one of the most significant forks in our entire family tree. He is the last common ancestor of the great human lineages of the late Ice Age. Imagine his population slowly spreading across the continents. One large group remains in the relative warmth and stability of Africa. Over the next hundreds of thousands of years, shaped by the African environment, they slowly evolve into us, Homo sapiens. Another group migrates north into Europe and Western Asia. There they face the harsh, unforgiving conditions of the recurring ice ages. A constant, brutal cycle of bitter cold periods and short, mild intermissions shapes their bodies and their minds. From them evolve the robust, cold-adapted Neanderthals. And yet another group, we now believe, moves even further east, deep into Asia, across the vast steppes. In this immense, often isolated world, they take their own unique evolutionary path. From them emerge the mysterious Denisovans. Homo heidelbergensis was the common trunk from which the three great branches of late human history split. After him, for a very long time, the world would not be a planet with just one human species, but a planet inhabited by several different intelligent human species at the same time. The stage for the final great drama was set. Of all the extinct human species that ever lived on this planet, none is as famous, as misunderstood, and yet as close to us as the Neanderthal. Named after the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf, Germany, where the first remains of this species were found in the mid-19th century, he continues to shape our image of the caveman to this day. But it is time to bid farewell to this old, distorted picture and to meet the true children of the Ice Age. The Neanderthals, who emerged from the European populations of Homo heidelbergensis, were masters of adaptation. Their entire body was a response to life in the cold of the recurring ice ages. They were not tall, but extremely strong and muscularly built, with a broad chest and short limbs. A compact physique that minimized heat loss. Their noses were large and voluminous, perhaps to warm and humidify the ice-cold, dry air of the steppe before it entered their lungs. They were the survival artists of the North. And we must definitively abandon the cliché of the brutish, club-wielding savage. Neanderthals were highly intelligent and successful hunters. They didn't just hunt deer or wild horses. They had the courage and skill to take on the giants of the Ice Age, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, and even the colossal woolly mammoth. This required not only strength, but sophisticated strategies, perfect knowledge of the landscape, and close cooperation within the group. Their tool technology, the Mousterian culture, was a clear upgrade from that of their ancestors. They no longer just made crude hand axes, but a variety of specialized tools, fine scrapers to process hides, sharp blades for cutting, and they likely already attached stone points to wooden shafts to create more effective thrusting spears. They masterfully controlled fire and used it to warm their caves and cook their food. Their brain, on average, was even slightly larger than our own. It was just shaped differently, a bit longer and flatter. This does not mean they were less intelligent than our direct ancestors. They were likely our equals, just different. Their brain was perhaps specialized for other things, for spatial orientation, for visually grasping their immediate surroundings, skills that were vital for a hunter on the Ice Age steppe. And they had, we now believe, a rich inner world. At many sites across Europe, archaeologists have found evidence that Neanderthals intentionally buried their dead. They dug pits and placed the deceased inside, sometimes in a sleeping position. This is more than just disposing of a corpse. It is an act of respect, a sign that they were aware of death, that they perhaps mourned. We also find traces of symbolic thought. They used red and black pigments like ochre, perhaps to paint their bodies. They pierced shells and wore them as jewelry. In a cave in Croatia, they found the talons of a white-tailed eagle that had been worked, presumably to be worn as a necklace or pendant. All these small, fleeting clues paint a picture of a complex being. When they buried their dead, what were they thinking? When they adorned themselves with the talons of an eagle, what were they feeling? It is not too far-fetched to imagine that they hoped, loved, and suffered, much like us. They were not almost human. They were simply another form of human. While the Neanderthals dominated Western Eurasia, another human lineage was evolving in the East, across the vast expanses of Asia. For decades, we knew nothing of their existence. They were a lost chapter in our history. Their discovery is one of the most incredible stories of modern science. Because they were revealed not by the discovery of a skull or a skeleton, but by a tiny, inconspicuous piece of bone. The story begins in the Denisova cave, a remote site in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Archaeologists had been excavating there for years, finding stone tools and the remains of Neanderthals. But in 2008, they came across something minuscule, the tip of a small finger. It was so small that it must have belonged to a child, perhaps a young girl who had lived in this cave over 50,000 years ago. At first, it was thought to be the finger of a Neanderthal, but a team of geneticists at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, led by Svante Pääbo, decided to try to extract DNA from this tiny bone fragment, an enormous technical challenge. The result of this analysis was a scientific sensation, a shock that shook the world of paleoanthropology. The DNA from the little finger bone matched neither the DNA of Neanderthals nor that of modern humans. It was different, completely different. The team had discovered an entirely new, previously unknown human species. Today, we call them the Denisovans, after the site of their discovery. They were a sister group to the Neanderthals. Their common ancestor, just as with the Neanderthals, was Homo heidelbergensis. But while one lineage moved west and became Neanderthals, the other moved east and became Denisovans. They likely populated large parts of Asia, from the cold steppes of Siberia to perhaps even the warm regions of Southeast Asia. But here lies the great mystery. Apart from this finger bone, a few teeth, and a mandible recently found in Tibet, we know almost nothing about them. We do not know what they looked like. We do not know what tools they made or what their culture was exactly like. They are like ghosts from the past, a phantom population made visible to us only through the tiny traces they left behind in their DNA. Their existence is a powerful testament to how incomplete our knowledge of our own history still is. It shows us that the human family bush was even denser and more complex than we ever imagined. And it lets us suspect that in the vast, still unexplored regions of Asia, there may be other, undiscovered human species waiting to be revealed. Yet, although we hardly know what the Denisovans looked like, they have not vanished without a trace. Their genetic legacy lives on. It lives on in the DNA of some modern humans today, especially in the indigenous peoples of Australia, New Guinea, and the Philippines. Up to 5% of Denisovan DNA can be found. A whisper from a distant past, captured in the genes of the present. Proof that our stories are forever interwoven. The discovery of the Denisovans would have been absolutely impossible just a few decades ago. It is the direct result of a scientific revolution that has fundamentally changed our understanding of the past. The revolution of paleogenetics. Imagine a tiny splinter of bone, no larger than a fingernail, that has lain for tens of thousands of years in the cold floor of a cave. It is fragile, contaminated with the bacteria and fungi of countless generations. And yet, hidden within it is an entire lost chapter of human history. because in the cells of this bone, the remnants of its original DNA still slumber. Paleogenetics is the art and science of extracting precisely this ancient DNA, deciphering it, and reading it. It is like finding a book that has been torn into a million tiny, faded scraps and trying to piece it back together. For a long time, this was considered unimaginable. But through the groundbreaking work of researchers like Svante Pääbo, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for it in 2022, new, incredibly precise methods were developed to make these genetic ghosts of the past speak. And what they tell us has turned our picture of human evolution upside down. First, through genes, we can determine relationships with exact precision. We can compare the DNA of a Neanderthal with that of a modern human and a chimpanzee, and we see clearly the Neanderthal is our much closer relative. We share a common ancestor who is much more recent than the one we share with chimpanzees. We can reconstruct population history. We can see how large populations were, whether they went through crises, or if they were growing. But perhaps the greatest and most personal discovery that paleogenetics has given us is the proof of interbreeding between the different human species. When the ancestors of modern humans left Africa and arrived in Eurasia, they encountered worlds that were already inhabited. They met the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, and they did what humans have perhaps always done when they meet strangers. They didn't just fight each other. They didn't just exchange knowledge. They also fell in love. They had children together. And these encounters have left undeniable traces in all of us. Almost every person today whose ancestors do not exclusively come from sub-Saharan Africa carries about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. A small but significant legacy that has influenced traits like our skin, our hair, and even parts of our immune system. Genetics has shattered the old, neat picture of clearly separate species existing side by side. It shows us a much more complex, messier, and perhaps more human picture. A vast network of encounters, of exchange, of conflict, and of love. It shows us we are not pure Homo sapiens. We are all a genetic mosaic, a product of these ancient encounters. Each of us is a living archive, a witness to this time when the world was still a planet full of humans. While the Neanderthals mastered the icy landscapes of Europe, clinging to the cold and hunting mammoths, and while the mysterious Denisovans roamed the vast, unexplored expanses of Asia, evolution in the cradle of humankind in Africa took its own fateful path. Here, in the savannas and forests that had given birth to our genus, a new species evolved from the descendants of Homo heidelbergensis, a species that, at first glance, seemed more fragile than its robust cousins to the north, but possessed a mind that would one day not just populate the world, but fundamentally change it. This is the beginning of our own direct story, the story of Homo sapiens, the wise human. The oldest traces we have found of them so far come, surprisingly, not from East Africa, which was long considered the sole cradle, but from the West. In a cave called Jebel Irhoud in modern-day Morocco, the fossilized remains of several individuals were found, men, women, and children. And when their age was determined, the the scientific community held its breath. Over 300,000 years, half an eternity earlier than had previously been assumed. When we reconstruct the skeletons of these early Homo sapiens, we immediately recognize ourselves. Their physique was already astonishingly modern. They were more slender and taller, less muscle-bound than the Neanderthals. Their bodies were no longer designed to retain heat, but to release it in a hot climate. Their faces were smaller, more delicately featured, and sat directly under the forehead, almost tucked away beneath the large brain case, and their skull itself already had the characteristic shape we have today, high and round, like a ball, housing a newly organized brain. And they possessed that one strange feature that almost all of our relatives lacked, a prominent, forward-projecting chin. Anatomically speaking, they were already us, a reflection of ourselves from an unimaginably distant past. But here, at this very point, we encounter one of the greatest and most profound mysteries of our own history, a mystery that should make us humble. Although these early humans looked like us, although they possessed our bodies and our brain size for an unimaginably long time, they did not yet behave like us. For over 200,000 years, a span of time 4 times as long as the entire recorded history since the first pharaohs, their tools were barely distinguishable from those of the Neanderthals. They lived as hunters and gatherers in small, nomadic groups, moving through the African landscape. Their daily life was a constant, harsh struggle for survival, marked by the same fundamental challenges that their human cousins in Europe and Asia also had to face: finding food, raising children, avoiding predators. They looked like us, but they did not quite think like us yet. The modern hardware, the body, and the brain was there. But the revolutionary software, the operating system of the modern mind that enables creativity, complex symbolism, and the capacity for mass cooperation, that still seemed to be dormant. It was as if an incredibly powerful computer was sitting on the table, but was running on only a very simple old program. The great decisive question of our history, therefore, is this: what was the spark? What was the trigger that finally activated this new software, unleashed its full potential, and awakened the sleeping giant within us? So, what was the spark that ignited the modern mind? For a long time, scientists favored a simple, almost dramatic explanation. They called it the cognitive revolution, or the great leap forward. The theory proposed that around 50,000 years ago, there was a sudden, revolutionary change. Perhaps a single random genetic mutation that rewired our brains, endowing us overnight with entirely new abilities, with complex language, with symbolic thought, with boundless creativity. A single Big Bang inside the head that instantly made us superior to all other human species. It is a tempting, almost cinematic idea. But today we know that reality was more subtle, slower, and perhaps even more fascinating. Most researchers no longer believe in a sudden explosion. Instead, they see a slow, gradual evolution of behavior. A process that did not first occur in Europe, but one that is deeply rooted in our African homeland and stretched over tens of thousands of years. The evidence for this is like quiet sparks in the darkness of a long past. Long before the famous cave paintings were created in Europe, we find in Africa the first delicate signs of a mind that was beginning not just to see the world, but to give it meaning. In South Africa, in caves like the Blombos Cave, archaeologists are finding pieces of red ochre that are over 100,000 years old. Ochre is a soft, earthy rock that can be ground into a vibrant red powder. What did they use it for? To paint their bodies? To dye leather? To perform rituals? We don't know for sure, but we know they collected it, processed it, and used it. Red, the color of blood, of life, of fire, held a special meaning for them. In the same cave, something even more astonishing was found. Small, perforated sea snails, clearly used as beads for a necklace or as ornaments for clothing. Over 75,000 years old. This is not just decoration. This is identity. This is a sign that says, I belong to this group, or I am this person. And on some of these ochre pieces, we find the oldest known drawings of humankind, complex geometric patterns of crossed lines and triangles. This is not random scribbling. This is an abstract symbol, a code. Here, in these small, inconspicuous finds, something entirely new begins. The thinking in signs and meanings. The ability to give a red stone, a shell, or an engraving a value that extends far beyond its mere materiality. It is the beginning of everything we call culture, art, and religion. One could say the birth of art was the beginning of true humanity. The modern mind did not explode suddenly. It awoke slowly, like a flower unfolding its petals over an infinitely long time. A spark here, a new idea there. A long creeping process that eventually equipped our ancestors with the most powerful weapon evolution has ever produced. So, what was this most powerful weapon that set our ancestors apart from all others? It was not a tool of stone or bone. It was something invisible, something fleeting, that leaves no fossils behind. It was the development of a unique and revolutionary form of language. Of course, other human species, like the Neanderthals, certainly had a form of communication. They could probably warn each other, call out, perhaps even give simple instructions. Watch out, a lion, or come here. But the language of Homo sapiens developed a completely new dimension. It was no longer just a language that referred to the here and now, to what one could directly see and touch. It became a language capable of transcending time and space. A language to talk about the past. Do you remember the hunt from last moon? A language to talk about the future. Tomorrow, we will go to the great river because the herds will be there. And a language to gossip about social relationships. Did you hear what he said to her? This ability to efficiently exchange social information was crucial for holding larger and more complex groups together. But the truly revolutionary ability of our language, its true superpower, was the ability to speak about things that do not exist at all. The capacity for fiction. A monkey cannot say to another monkey, "Give me your banana today, and after you die, you will receive countless bananas in the great banana heaven." Only Homo sapiens can invent and believe such stories. We can talk about spirits that live in the forest, about ancestors who watch over us from the sky, about tribal gods who protect us as long as we follow their rules. This ability to create a shared fictional reality may sound trivial, but it is the glue that holds human civilization together. A Neanderthal could probably only cooperate effectively in a small group of perhaps 30, at most 50 individuals, a group in which everyone knew, trusted, or distrusted each other personally. Beyond this limit, it became difficult because one did not know whom to trust. But Homo sapiens, thanks to shared myths and stories, he could cooperate in groups of hundreds or even thousands of individuals who had never seen each other before. Two men from different valleys, who had never met, could go hunting together because they both believed in the same great eagle spirit that was their tribal symbol. A shared belief, a shared story, a shared identity binds strangers together in a way that is unprecedented in the animal kingdom. It enables cooperation on a vast, flexible scale. It is this ability that would later make possible the founding of villages, cities, nations, and empires. All these large human collectives are based not on personal acquaintance, but on the shared belief in a story. The story of a nation, the story of a god, the story of human rights, or the story of the value of money. Long before we lived in villages, we already lived in stories. And these stories gave us the power to change the world. Equipped with this new, invisible superpower, the ability to cooperate in large, flexible groups through shared stories, Homo sapiens was now ready for his final great departure. About 70,000 years ago, a small group of our ancestors left the African continent. This was not the first attempt, but this time it would be successful and would change the demographic map of the entire planet forever. We call it the Out of Africa to migration. We must not imagine these pioneers as great folk migrations or organized armies. They were often just tiny groups, perhaps no more than a few dozen men, women, and children who dared to leap into the unknown. They likely followed the coastlines from one bay to the next, living off what the sea and the land offered them. In the Middle East, they encountered a world that had already been inhabited by Neanderthals for tens of thousands of years. It was here that those encounters took place, which we can now read in our DNA. There was conflict, there was exchange, and there was interbreeding. A part of the Neanderthal heritage was absorbed into us. From this crossroads, Homo sapiens spread with astonishing, almost uncanny speed. One wave migrated west along the coasts of the Mediterranean and reached Europe, the stronghold of the Neanderthals, about 45,000 years ago. Another larger wave moved east, deep into Asia. There, too, they met other humans, the Denisovans, and the story of encounter and interbreeding repeated itself. But our ancestors did not stop. They accomplished pioneering feats that still take our breath away today. About 65,000 years ago, they reached the continent of Sahul, which is now Australia and New Guinea, connected at the time by a land bridge. This is one of the most incredible achievements in our history. To get there, they had to cross the open sea. Dozens of kilometers of water separated the islands of Southeast Asia from this new continent. They must have managed it with nothing but their courage, their knowledge of the currents, and the stars. And simple rafts or boats made of bamboo. They were the first great seafarers of humankind. Other groups adapted to the extreme conditions of the cold. They learned to survive in tailored clothing made from animal hides and hunted the great herds of the Ice Age steppe ever further north until they reached the icy expanses of Siberia. From there, they achieved the last great conquest. During the peak of the last ice age, the sea level was so low that a vast land bridge emerged between Siberia and Alaska, Beringia. About 15,000 years ago, small groups of hunters crossed this bridge and set foot on an entirely new, untouched double continent, America. Within a few millennia, they spread from the Arctic to the tip of Tierra del Fuego. It is a breathtaking record. Within just about 50,000 years, a mere blink of an eye in Earth's history, a single small African species had settled almost every habitable corner of the planet. From the icy coasts of the Arctic to the tropical rainforests of the Amazon, from the deserts of Australia to the most remote islands of the Pacific. The conquest of the world was complete. Wherever Homo sapiens went, he left behind not only his tools and the bones of his prey. He left behind something entirely new. The traces of a mind that no longer sought merely to survive, but also to understand its world, to interpret it, and to charge it with meaning. Especially in Europe, starting around 40,000 BC, we witness a true explosion of culture, a firework of creativity so sudden and so powerful that it continues to fill us with awe to this day. The most impressive evidence of this explosion is found deep underground in the silent, eternal nights of the great caves. What drives a human, at the risk of his life, with only the flickering light of a small, fat-burning lamp, to crawl deep into a pitch-black cold cave? Past narrow crevices and over treacherous abysses, only to paint images of breathtaking beauty on the hidden walls. In caves like Chauvet and Lascaux in France, or Altamira in Spain, we find them, the first great art galleries of humankind. These are not simple stick figures. They are masterly, naturalistic depictions of the great animals of the Ice Age. We see herds of galloping horses that seem to almost storm across the rock face. We see mighty aurochs and bison that use the bulges of the cave wall to create a three-dimensional effect. We see lions on the hunt, woolly rhinoceroses, and graceful deer. What was the purpose of this art? Was it purely decorative? Was it hunting magic intended to cast a spell on the animals? Was it the records of shamanic journeys into a spirit world? Or were they sacred places, the cathedrals of the Stone Age, where the myths and creation stories of the tribe were passed down from generation to generation? We do not know, but we can feel the reverence and the spiritual power that emanates from these places. But art did not only happen on the walls. Our ancestors also created art that one could hold in one's hands, carry with oneself. They carved the first sculptures. Famous are the so-called Venus figurines, small statuettes of women with lush, exaggerated forms, like the famous Venus of Hohlfels. Were they fertility symbols, depictions of a mother goddess? We can only speculate. And they created enigmatic hybrid beings. Perhaps the most impressive example is the Lion Man from the Hohenstein-Stadel in Germany, an almost 40-centimeter tall upright figure made of mammoth ivory, half human, half cave lion. This is no longer a depiction of reality. This is a clear sign of a complex mythology, of the ability to imagine beings that exist beyond the visible world. And in the silence of these caves, they made music. Archaeologists have found precisely crafted flutes carved from the hollow bones of griffin vultures or from mammoth ivory. They have multiple tones and, when reconstructed today, sound astonishingly clear and melodic. Imagine that for a moment, the echo of a bone flute reverberating through the darkness of a cave 35,000 years ago, accompanied by singing around a warming fire. Perhaps they sang to give themselves courage in the dark, or to remember the stories that made them who they were. Humans who no longer just existed, but were beginning to give their existence meaning. And so, we come to the great, uncomfortable, and perhaps saddest question of our entire history. We have seen that the world was once a planet full of humans, a colorful place populated by different intelligent species, by the robust children of the Ice Age, the Neanderthals in Europe, by the ghostly Denisovans in Asia, by the tiny hobbit, Homo floresiensis, on the islands of Indonesia. But today, nothing of that remains. At the end of all these millions of years of evolution, only a single species was left. United States, Homo sapiens. Why? Around the same time that our ancestors spread across the globe, all the others vanished. The Neanderthals disappeared from Europe about 40,000 years ago. Their last refuges, perhaps on the Iberian Peninsula. The Denisovans vanished from Asia, and the little Homo floresiensis also lost its struggle for survival. It is as if a silent wave rolled over the world, washing away all other shores of humanity. The search for the reason for this great extinction is one of the biggest and most hotly debated mysteries in archaeology. There is no single, simple answer. There are several theories, and each one probably holds a piece of the truth. The first theory is that of displacement and competition. Were we simply the more efficient hunters? Did we have better tools, a more flexible diet, or a higher birth rate? Did we slowly but surely push the Neanderthals to the brink in the daily competition for resources, for the best caves and the richest hunting grounds until they starved? It may not have been an open war, but a long, grueling war of attrition that we ultimately won. The second theory is darker. It is that of violence and extermination. The history of Homo sapiens is, unfortunately, also a history of intolerance and violence towards those who are different. Did we actively fight and exterminate our close relatives? Was it the first unwritten genocide in history? Direct evidence for this is hard to find, but sadly, it lies within the realm of possibility. The third theory is that of interbreeding and assimilation. We know that we interbred with them. Perhaps the incoming Homo sapiens were simply so much more numerous that the smaller populations of Neanderthals and Denisovans were simply absorbed into our gene pool over the generations. Their genes live on in us, but their independent culture, their language, and their identity were lost forever in the process. And the fourth theory is about invisible killers. Did we bring diseases with us from Africa? Tropical viruses and bacteria against which our immune systems had developed some resistance, but against which the Neanderthals' immune systems were completely powerless. A deadly pandemic that finished them off long before we might have even come into direct conflict. The most likely answer is that it was not a single cause. It was a tragic combination of all these factors. A bit of competition here, a bit of violence there, interbreeding in another place, and perhaps the final blow delivered by imported diseases. But if there was one single overriding superpower that gave us the decisive advantage, it was the one we discussed before. Our ability to cooperate in large, flexible groups. The small, close-knit clans of the Neanderthals, which perhaps never numbered more than 50 members, had nothing to counter this new form of mass organization in the long run. Our greatest weapon was not the spear or the hand axe. It was our story. The ability to create a shared narrative that welded hundreds of strangers into an unbeatable community. And so, here we stand today, alone, the sole heirs of a once so diverse planet of humans. Our journey through the long, deep prehistory is approaching its end. We have seen how our ancestors learned to walk upright, created the first tool, tamed fire, and, as the only human species, settled the entire world. But the greatest and most consequential change of all was yet to come. It was triggered by a force greater than any human invention, the planet itself. About 12,000 years ago, something happened. The Earth ended its long, cold breath. The last great ice age came to a close. The enormous glaciers that had buried large parts of the northern hemisphere under kilometers of thick ice began to melt. Slowly but unstoppably, they retreated, liberating the land once more. The climate did not just become warmer. Much more importantly, it became more stable and humid. The wild, unpredictable climate fluctuations of the Ice Age gave way to a new, predictable order. This is the beginning of the Holocene, the geological epoch in which we still live today. The world took a breath. It became greener and it became fuller. The barren, cold steppes that were once the realm of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses were transformed. Lush forests spread. Fertile valleys emerged, and vast grasslands grew as far as the eye could see. At the same time, it was a farewell, a melancholic farewell to an old world. The great, iconic animals of the Ice Age, which had accompanied our ancestors for millennia, nourished them, and populated their myths, found no place in this new, warmer world. They went extinct. A world came to an end, so that a new one could arise. And this new world was a paradise, at least at first glance, especially in a region we now call the Fertile Crescent, an arc stretching from modern-day Egypt through Israel, Syria, and Turkey to Iraq. Here, certain grasses with large, nutritious seeds began to grow in a density the world had never seen before. They were the wild ancestors of wheat and barley. Entire groves of pistachio and almond trees emerged, and the rivers and lakes were teeming with fish and waterfowl. For the last hunters and gatherers living in this region, a true golden age dawned. There was so much food in one place that they could do something that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. They could become sedentary, without planting a single seed. They built the first permanent settlements, small villages of round stone huts. They harvested the wild grain, hunted the gazelles, and lived in abundance. They stood on the threshold of a new world, but they did not yet know that they were about to open a door that could never be closed again. Agriculture is often hailed as humanity's greatest invention, a stroke of genius that lifted us from a brutish existence into the light of civilization. But was it really progress, or was it a trap that we unwittingly walked into? The truth is, agriculture was not a sudden idea, not a brilliant insight that a single person had one day. It was a very slow, almost imperceptible process that unfolded over thousands of years. It was a gradual farewell to the old ways, driven not by a grand vision, but by a series of small, pragmatic decisions. It likely began with the hunter-gatherers of the Fertile Crescent simply tending to the wild plants they favored. When they came to a patch of wild wheat, they might have pulled out the competing weeds. They might have chased away animals that were eating the grain. And when they carried the harvested grain back to their camp, some seeds would inevitably spill along the way, helping the plants to spread into new areas. They were managing nature long before they controlled it. The decisive step came when they began to understand the connection between seed and plant. They noticed that the plants with the largest seeds, or a stalk that didn't shatter and drop its seeds at the slightest touch, were the most valuable. So they started to collect the seeds from these specific superior plants and deliberately sowed them in cleared patches of ground near their settlements. This was the beginning of artificial selection. Unconsciously at first, they became the first gardeners and breeders, using the rules of evolution to their own advantage. Generation after generation, they selected for the most desirable traits. The wheat stalks became stronger, the grains larger. The plants became more and more dependent on humans for their survival, and in turn, the humans became more and more dependent on the plants. It was a slow, codependent dance. And this process was not unique to one place. It was invented independently in various parts of the world as different peoples responded to the opportunities of the new Holocene climate. In the Fertile Crescent, it was wheat, barley, and lentils starting around 9,500 BC. In China, along the great rivers, it was rice and millet. In Central and South America, it was maize, beans, and squash. And in the highlands of New Guinea, it was taro and bananas. Each time it was the same slow, gradual process. A long goodbye to a life of roaming and a hesitant step into a new world of toil, but also of unprecedented abundance. The trap had been set. As humans began to bind themselves to the land, they also began to reshape their relationship with the animal world. The animals that they had hunted for millennia, their adversaries and their prey, would slowly be transformed into their partners. The domestication of animals, much like that of plants, was a long, gradual process. It likely began not with a desire for companionship, but with a more practical goal, a reliable food source. Instead of hunting a whole herd of wild sheep or goats and having too much meat at once, perhaps a group of hunters managed to drive the entire herd into a corral or a canyon. They now had a living pantry, a supply of fresh meat on the hoof. Within this captive herd, they began to make choices. They would slaughter the most aggressive or unruly animals first, while allowing the more docile, manageable ones to live and reproduce. Generation after generation, this artificial selection favored traits like tameness, faster growth, and a higher tolerance for living close to humans. The wild, fearful instincts of their ancestors were slowly bred out of them. The opponent was becoming an ally. The very first of these animal partners, however, joined us long before the dawn of agriculture. Our first ally from the animal kingdom was the wolf. Sometime deep in the Ice Age, perhaps 15,000 to 30,000 years ago, certain groups of wolves began to shadow human hunting camps, drawn by the prospect of leftover scraps. The less fearful wolves got more food, and a bond began to form. Over time, humans and wolves became hunting partners. This ancient wolf, through a long process of domestication, became the dog. He was our first and most loyal companion. Perhaps his bark in the night was the very first wake-up call of civilization. Later, in the Fertile Crescent, as agriculture took hold, other animals followed. The wild sheep and goats of the mountains were the first to be domesticated for their meat, milk, and wool. Then came the pig, an efficient converter of scraps into protein. And finally, the mighty aurochs, the wild ancestor of cattle, was tamed. A much more dangerous and difficult undertaking, but one that offered immense rewards. This new partnership changed everything. Animals no longer just provided a one-time meal. They offered a continuous supply of milk, cheese, and yogurt. They gave us wool and leather for clothing. And eventually they would lend us their immense muscle power, pulling the plows that would till the fields and turn the wheels that would build the cities. The human world was no longer powered by human muscle alone. It was now powered by our new four-legged partners. Agriculture and the sedentary lifestyle were not minor adjustments. They were the greatest and most profound revolution our species has ever experienced. They changed not only how we ate, but also how we lived, how we thought, and how we died. It was a pact with nature that brought us immeasurable blessings, and at the same time afflicted us with a terrible curse. The blessing was obvious. For the first time in human history, more food could be produced than was immediately needed. A food surplus. This was the foundation for everything that followed. One could store provisions for the winter, for periods of drought, or for bad harvests. The constant, gnawing fear of starvation that had defined the lives of hunters and gatherers seemed to be banished. This new, secure food base led to a population explosion. The intervals between births could shorten, and more children survived. The small, nomadic groups of a few dozen people grew into large, permanent settlements. People stayed in one place and built permanent houses of mud brick and stone. The first villages, and soon after the first cities in the world, emerged, like Jericho in Palestine or the massive Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey. And in these large communities, not everyone had to be a farmer anymore. The food surplus allowed for the specialization of labor. Some could focus on making better pots to store the grain. Others became weavers, tool makers, or later smiths who worked the first metal. and still others took on new intellectual roles. They became priests who performed the rituals for a good harvest, or leaders who organized the community. But this blessing came at a high price. The curse was subtle, but devastating. The life of an early farmer was often infinitely harder and more labor-intensive than that of a hunter-gatherer. Hours of monotonous toil in the fields under the burning sun replaced the varied activity of hunting and gathering. The diet became more one-sided. Instead of a variety of dozens of different plants, nuts, fruits, and meats, the diet now often consisted mainly of grain. This led to new deficiency diseases, to smaller body sizes, and to worn-out teeth and joints, as we can see from the skeletons. And the close cohabitation of many people and their animals in a confined space created a paradise for pathogens. What once offered protection became the breeding ground for the first great plagues. Viruses and bacteria that jumped from domesticated animals to humans triggered epidemics like smallpox, measles, or the flu, which raged through the dense settlements. Perhaps the most profound change, however, was the invention of property. Suddenly there was land that one owned, a house that one had built, supplies that one had stored. And where there is property, there is also theft and envy. This led to the emergence of social inequality. There were now the rich and the poor, powerful families who controlled more land and more supplies than others. And it led to organized warfare. The fight for fertile land, for water rights, and for stolen provisions was now fought between entire villages. Humankind had tamed the soil, and in the same moment had made itself more vulnerable than ever before. Our long, quiet journey through time is approaching its end. We have walked a path that stretches across millions of years, from the forests of Africa to the very edge of history as we know it. We began our journey in a distant green world when one of our ancestors took the first daring step out of the safety of the trees and stood up straight to look out over the tall grass of the savanna. We felt the significance of that moment, when the hands became free to carry, to shape, and to create. We were there when the first thought was struck from a stone, when a Homo habilis, with intention and foresight, no longer just used an object but fashioned it into a tool, thereby pushing open the door to technology. We sat with Homo erectus by the first warming campfire, feeling its protective power against the darkness and the predators of the night, and watched as he, driven by curiosity and necessity, became the first pioneer to cross the borders of Africa and discover the wide world. We looked into the eyes of our close relatives, the Neanderthals, the children of the Ice Age. We recognized in them not the caricature of a caveman, but another successful form of humanity, with its own intelligence, its own culture, and perhaps its own deep emotions. And we witnessed the quiet rise of our own species. We saw how Homo sapiens, through the revolutionary power of language and shared stories, gained the ability to cooperate in large, flexible groups, an invisible force that enabled him to conquer the entire planet and leave all other human species behind. Our history has been shaped by two fundamental revolutions: the cognitive revolution, which unleashed our minds and made us the storytellers of this planet, and the Neolithic revolution, which changed our way of life forever and bound us to the soil. It teaches us that our development was not a straight, inevitable line of progress up a ladder, but a winding, often random path through a dense bush full of dead ends, astonishing experiments, and unlikely successes. The 10,000 years that have passed since the invention of agriculture may seem like an eternity to us. They encompass all empires, all wars, all books ever written, but they are just a tiny fraction of our entire history, a mere blink of an eye. For over 99% of our time as the genus Homo, we have lived as nomadic hunters and gatherers. And this infinitely long past has cast a deep shadow over us, an echo that resonates to this day in every fiber of our being. Our bodies and our minds are still adapted to that old, wild world. Our craving for sweet, fatty, and salty foods was once a vital survival instinct in a sparse environment where every calorie counted. Today, in a world of unlimited abundance, this instinct often becomes a burden to our health. And our brain, our Stone Age brain, it yearns for the manageability and rhythm of that ancient world. It longs for community, for the feeling of belonging to a small, familiar tribe of about 50 to 150 people. It is ill-equipped to handle the anonymous masses of millions, the constant sensory overload of digital media, the endless flood of information, and the permanent connectivity of our modern world. We live in high-tech cities of glass and steel, but we do so with the heart, the brain, and the instincts of a human who was made for a life on the Savanna. Many of the problems and anxieties of our modern society arise precisely from this profound contradiction. The sedentary life was the point of no return. The pact with the farmland was sealed and irreversible. The hunter-gatherer had become a farmer. The nomad had become a settler. And this fundamental shift created the necessary conditions for everything that followed. The surplus of grain had to be stored and managed. From this necessity, the first writing emerged, initially in the form of simple counting tokens, later as complex systems of signs. The growing village communities had to be organized, and conflicts over land and water had to be settled. From this necessity, the first laws, the first states, and the first bureaucratic empires arose in the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And the belief in shared stories, which once held us together as small tribes, grew into the great, organized world religions, capable of uniting millions of people under a common moral and spiritual roof. Our long, silent journey through prehistory, which we can only reconstruct from bones, stones, and genes, ends here. The loud, written history, as we know it, with its kings and queens, its wars and revolutions, can now begin. We are the result of an incredibly long, fragile, and often highly improbable chain of events. The product of cosmic coincidences, geological upheavals, climatic catastrophes, and countless evolutionary experiments. We are the sole survivors of a once so diverse planet of humans. This fact alone should fill us not with pride, but with a deep, quiet humility. For the first time in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth, a single species is capable of consciously reflecting on its own origin, and at the same time possesses the power to determine the future of the entire planet, a power that is as creative as it is destructive. Our story is not yet finished. The next chapters are in our hands. And perhaps, If we listen very closely and quietly within ourselves, they are also in the soft voices of our ancestors.